Maybe we should start. And yeah, I'm very pleased to open the last but not least panel on cultural production in the Gulf. Maybe you expect from the program Anthony Theo here. I'm not Anthony. I'm Veronica Defner from also working at the MEI here in Singapore. Yeah, let me introduce to you. We have a shorter panel now with only two talks, but we are embracing the broad spectrum of cultural production by from filmmaking to literature and poetry. And our first speaker is Professor Dale Hudson. He's an associate teaching professor of film and new media and curator of film and new media at the New York University in Abu Dhabi. He has a Master of Arts from New York University, and he earned his PhD from the University of Massachusetts. With Patricia Zimmerman, he co-authored the book Thinking Through Digital Media, Transnational Environments and Locative Places. As a digital curator for the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, he also curated Viral Dissonance in 2014. And Dale Hudson was also a member of the pre-selection committee for the 2014 Abu Dhabi Film Festival. I will introduce to you Nele later, and the floor is open to you, Dale.
All right, hello. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the organizers, and thanks to all of you for staying for the very last panel after lunch. I'm going to read my paper because that's the way we do it in my field, but I've been very jealous of people who've been able to kind of talk and stay on time. So my paper is called Locating Emirati Filmmaking. Okay, although a few Kuwaiti and Bahraini feature films appeared in international film festivals as far back as the early 1970s, it was not really for another 4 decades that the Arabian Gulf would again register to foreign audiences through the major international film festivals in Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. United Arab Emirates had already figured prominently in the art world, and this is through the Sharjah Biennale since 1993, Art Dubai since 2006, and more recently through the protests by the artist activist collective Gulf Labor over the conditions for migrant workers for the Guggenheim Museum on Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi. Unlike these arts initiatives, the ones for film have often been stalled by major setbacks, including the cancellation of the permanent postponement of the Gulf Film Festival in 2013. I'm sorry, my orders with the slides. Those are the protests. So these are the institutions we have here. So the Gulf Film Festival from 2013 was canceled. The Abu Dhabi Film Festival was canceled very suddenly last spring, foreclosing two of the most important venues for filmmaking from and about the UAE and broader GCC region, that is, local perspectives on the region. Moreover, these setbacks risk the negative international criticisms of alleged lack of seriousness in the UAE, and that gets leveled against regarding film in this case, but against almost any industry. It remains to be seen whether the cancellation of ADF will follow the precedent in neighboring Qatar of the cancellation of the Doha Tribeca Film Festival after its 4 editions in 2012 to create space for 2 smaller new festivals, one focusing on youth-based programming and the other one, Kumra, which focuses on first and second-time filmmakers. Despite these setbacks and uncertainties, however, and even the controversies, private and state agencies in the UAE have created space for a new generation of feature filmmakers who began making short films supported by less internationally visible international institutes, such as the Emirates Film Competition, which dates to 2001, the Moore Awards at the Dubai International Film Festival since 2006, and to some extent the Emirati Cinema Campaign from 2013. Emirati filmmakers have produced more than 20 narrative and documentary features that I'm aware of since Ali Al-Dul's Abr Sabil from 1989, which is generally considered the first feature produced by an Emirati filmmaker. This output is prolific for a place that typically has no typical infrastructure to nurture active film culture, such as a Cinematheque or a film journal for serious debates where they can take place, or even a film school for technical training. Unlike Kuwait, where film clubs have existed since pre-independence, the ones in Abu Dhabi and Dubai in particular have been launched and cancelled more or less contingent upon the resources and dedication of individuals rather than through state support. One of the most productive ones, in my opinion, is the Zayed University Middle East Film Festival, or ZUMEF, which was established in 2010, and that was actually a senior project for 2 students there, and it's continued on. And gotten quite big these days. The big problem that I'm looking at is that few Emirati shorts or features have received theatrical exhibit or DVD release or even video on demand, even within the UAE. Most are exhibited at festivals or other non-theatrical venues, including cultural centers, schools, pop-up theaters, and also the so-called free platforms such as YouTube. As a consequence, foreign critics tend to subsume Emirati filmmaking under the assumptions and expectations about either Arab film, Middle East film, or MENA filmmaking, which, if you know the history of the Gulf, that cuts off a lot of the history. And focus on issues such as internationally visible ones, particularly at film festivals like Venice a few years back. Oppression of women is a topic that they like, religious fundamentalism, war, terrorism. And the case of UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, wealth and consumerism. So these are the images that tend to bubble up. Although academic studies make efforts to unsettle these, to unsettle these media stereotypes, international film festivals have both historically capitalized on them, and misrepresentations are transformed into profit without much consideration for the potential damage they inflict. And that's like these Hollywood films. So this is Mission Impossible 4, that was shot in Dubai, partly in Dubai. Some of the earliest features, and this is another example, shot in Morocco. It's Sex and the City 2. So what gets erased is this. Some of the earliest features produced in the Gulf by like Khalifa Shaheen from Bahrain, Khalid al-Siddiq from Kuwait. And these are films that aren't readily available on DVD. You can find Bastia Bahar on YouTube, actually. Which is nice. It's not subtitles, so you have to speak Gulf Arabic. Self-representation for Gulf filmmakers thus is important both at home and abroad as a corrective to misrepresentations and also to erasures. More significantly, both by countering and ignoring foreign stereotypes, Emirati filmmakers contributes to the everyday practice of constructing and consolidating national identity in relationship to the relatively recent unification of various tribes into a single nation state, and this is only 1971. Also against historical marginalization of the Gulf Emirates in both the Arab and Muslim worlds, or their cultures, in relationship to centuries-old cultural and economic ties to South Asia and East Africa, and the cultural submersion by a majority expatriate population, most notably the middle-class families and also the migrant bachelors, as they're called, from South Asia, that constitute more than half the population of the state. I have a little graphic that I found online on that. In the domain of the film industry, Emirati filmmaking can inject a counter-narrative to the so-called universal stories on offer at the multiplexes and standalone theaters that are produced in places like Cairo, Mumbai, Los Angeles, and Chennai, all of whom have incorporated to some point negative stereotypes of Gulf Arabs as backwards and greedy, usually the stereotypes. So this paper is part of an effort to try to locate Emirati filmmaking within the context of colonial images from British and US industrial and education films. Those are both available on YouTube, as well as the context of pre-UAE film culture, which actually favored Hindi and English language films to Arabic language ones. And that's important when you're thinking about building an industry, is what language to do it in. I situate this question of locating Emirati filmmaking within the context of complex or competing expectations by audiences. Most filmmaking bears the responsibility of convening its own audience, and Emirati filmmaking is no exception. It has not followed the, quote, build it and they will come model. This is the aspirational model of planning that has made Dubai famous. Whether Emirati filmmaking will address itself primarily to nationals, to both nationals and expatriates, or to a broader audience, whether pan-Arab or international, remains to be determined, as does the question of whether the UAE will break with some of the more dominant models within the Manasa region, and I'm including South Asia in that purposefully. And those would be ones like, first of all, the commercial film industries in Egypt and India in particular, that prioritize entertainment and thus normalize often conservative politics, particularly concerning women and minoritized ethnic and religious groups. Number 2 would be the Iranian and Arab art filmmaking, and Turkish to some extent as well we could put in there, which counters the narratives of the commercial cinema, yet are often restrained by dependency upon foreign funding, and particularly European funding, which often has little clauses built into it about what you can and cannot put in the film, particularly in relationship to ongoing and past colonialism from Maghrebi Israeli and Palestinian filmmakers. That's a real issue. Number 3 is the monetization, and that you see in Morocco and Jordan historically, and Tunisia to some extent, and Israel, basically where these places become so-called, quote, locations for foreign films, without regard to their content or their potential collateral damage to international reputation. That's where I put Mission Impossible, Fast and Furious. There's lots of Bollywood films as well that do this. All those films kind of go into that category. And 4 is the one that Valerie was speaking about, which is the films that are made more or less for domestic consumption. And Morocco has a really strong program of supporting these with state. It's pre-sales, so it goes to television to support this filmmaking. But again, it doesn't transfer across borders sometimes, mostly because of language. The Cairo Arabic is the one that people will understand and listen to. So these are some of the dominant models. And I'm trying to think of ways that, and I often get asked this question, like how can Emirati filmmakers produce these films? So what are some other different ways that they might think about them? Particularly, since none of these models that I've discussed fulfills the historically, culturally, and above all financially different context of the UAE. And Qatar is somewhat similar to this. Bahrain and Kuwait are slightly different. So in terms of film festivals, I think, I'm not sure where I've lost my point with my slides. That one, I'm not sure where that one comes. The legacy of the images. In terms of film festivals for exhibition and development of film culture, the historical models for the MENA region are, of course, the Carthage Film Festival since 1966, which has been a forum for debates on Arab identity and Arab filmmaking, and the Cairo International Film Festival since 1976, which focused mostly on the commercial industry. It's changed a little bit in recent years. So those have been less significant to the models that were developed in the Gulf. Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi look towards different models that weren't necessarily concerned with Arab or Middle Eastern or any of these typical ethnic or geographical locations, and they wanted to really enter onto a world stage. So for this reason, I'm going to look at models that are outside this region that might actually be potentially useful for thinking about the media and pushing it forward, both in terms of film production and in terms of film exhibition. One is indigenous media practices, and those are most visible in Latin America and the Asia-Pacific regions. The other is the alternative commercial models, particularly Nigeria's Nollywood, and also South Korea's Hollywood, which we've talked about a few times already. And then the final is the effort of film festivals that actually have space for both indigenous media as well as commercial media and art media to share this single stage, which is like the Morelia Film Festival in Mexico is one of the ones that does that quite well. So looking at how these things how thinking about the Emirates can help us rethink these models that we've had. So since the 1990s, it has become increasingly difficult for states to isolate national cultures, which tend to fade and blend into transnational cultures in more accelerated and decentralized manner than they had in the past. The Gulf Emirates are particularly useful for such analysis of cultures and historiography in light of the historical transnational and transcultural networks that link the port cities and villages to the broader Indian Ocean world, all the way from China, Southeast Asia, through South Asia, and down to East Africa. The historical dimensions of this cultural diversity often compete with economic projects instituted by the state, particularly around consumerism and tourism, which attempt to construct this exclusively Arab-Muslim identity. Emiratis distinguish themselves from other Arabs in ways, but we have to remember that national consciousness is a relatively new phenomenon. And actually the term Emirati is only become used very recently. It used to be citizen, and this is my colleague Matthew McLean, who Gwen knows, is actually some of his research is looking at that and when this term actually came into use and people identified that way rather than by tribe or by city or whatever it happened to have been. So with filmmaking, we're kind of picking up on that. Although filmmaking in the UAE attempts to differentiate itself from these popular filmmaking conventions in Cairo, Chennai, Hyderabad, Mumbai, etc., it risks being subsumed by some of the policies that are in place into Hollywood and European models of being a, quote, Arab art cinema, which often entails political and artistic compromises demanded by foreign or expatriate producers and financiers for any manner of reason, often including financial, just where it will make money. Funded by Image Nation Abu Dhabi, the second features by Nawaf Al-Jahani and Ali Al-Mustafa, Sea Shadow and From A to B, 2011 and 2012, respectively, both demonstrate a technical maturity in the sense of conventional narrative structures and high production values, but I think that they come at expense of cultural relevance. By contrast, their first features, which are both much less technically savvy in some ways, particularly Al-Jahani's The Circle, really resonated with audiences. And when you watch these films with audiences, they really understand this film. They are interested in it. It's just it's like a murder mystery, actually. So it's kind of, it's not a specific story, but it's how the story is told that's really interesting, how audiences respond to it. City of Life actually gets into the multilingual aspects of life in Dubai, and that's interesting in the segregated spaces that we get through this neoliberal kind of urban design that we have. But they also offer more complex and less stereotypical examinations of life in the contemporary UAE. In fact, the evaluations of these things that are usually say that they're imperfect or somehow not great are usually by Hollywood and European trained critics or filmmakers, and they're actually reminiscent of early critiques of Nollywood, which I hope most of you are familiar with. If not, become familiar with it, because it's for film, it's most important, one of the most important things at the moment. Early critiques, particularly by Francophone African filmmakers, as well as foreigners, were that these films were they were shot in video. The old joke is that they were sold in wheelbarrows on the street. They were very low production values, but they resonated with audiences, and they've changed a lot. One of the first ones was Chris Oburabu's Living in Bondage from 1992, and now we have these ones that are so-called world-class festival films, like The Figurine from 2009. They're privately funded for the most part. The films engage ethnic, religious, linguistic difference in Nigeria, which is an extremely diverse place, and they're appealizing their attention to telling local stories, including ones about social problems, and storytelling modes that are very different from the ones in foreign films that were typically exhibited and consumed in Nigeria, which was mostly Bollywood films, Hong Kong films, and Hollywood films. In addition, another model is looking at the South Korean model, and that's where it's funded by the state, or at least there's a lot more state interaction with that one. And it's kind of the story, like the wheelbarrow story for Nollywood, the South Korea story, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, is that in 1992 the globalization policy shifted from making cars to making culture. And it realized that they could make more profits, but also that they would have that soft power, and also be able to negotiate the domestic unrest due to neoliberal policies within South Korea amongst classes by having kind of entertainment to distract them. So these are other models that can be used to think about it. And the reason I point out the K-dramas is that they're extremely popular in UAE and the Gulf. They often get broadcast both in dubbed and subtitled versions. South Korea's commitment to making media on its own terms, it kind of rejects the Hollywood model, suggests a model for developing filmmaking locally rather than selling out as an exotic location or a backdrop for Hollywood and European produced and financed films. And such investments can hopefully alter the terms upon which UAE is discussed. Somewhat like Al Jazeera let's say Al Jazeera Arabic pre-2011 had changed some of the terms that it was discussed. So I kind of situate a lot of the media that I see between transnational cinema and indigenous media. Although indigenous media is often associated with disempowered and disenfranchised populations, particularly ones who are dispossessed of territory and sovereignty, filmmaking in the GCC states somewhat counterintuitively shares a lot in common with indigenous media. The festivals often would show them at the same time as they show the big features, which is a little bit like Morelia. In terms of that dual programming thing, structure. And since 2003, Morelia has actually functioned primarily as a cultural event rather than a commercial one like Francis Cannes Film Festival, which is about buying films. It also includes these programs together. So that I think is an interesting model that was sort of tried but sort of abandoned. If we look at the actual Emirati shorts, they share a lot in common with indigenous media in terms of their rejection of the rules of commercial cinema and of art cinema to tell stories that might not make sense in these other kind of formats. Commercial film festivals like Sundance often make awards to the best filmmaker, the best actor, the best technicians, whereas indigenous media festivals often focus on awards for social commitment, and this is something that Amalio Cordova has written about. Production values are not universal criteria for evaluating significance of films, and that's something that indigenous media has really put forward into film studies. Many Emirati shorts also work toward this comparable objective, and these are some shots of filmmakers, and some of these are very important filmmakers at EFC and also at Moore. These short works do this comparable objective of sustaining cultural identity as a minority population. Indigenous media, you have to remember, is often inaccessible to foreigners, and sometimes it's even withheld from exhibition from anyone outside the community. Unlike the audiences, international audiences at ADFF and DIFF, when you go to the audience of these screenings, it's primarily Emiratis who are in the audience. When the post-screenings discussions take place, it takes place only in Arabic. There's no translation into English, which is kind of the default language for the festival, thereby reclaiming this space for Emirati identity and contention within the space of the larger international film festival. The shorts focus on identity. I'm like running short on time. Dialect, accent, culture, cultural environmental heritage, national dress, legends, the realities of being a minority in their home state. Others address social problems such as mixed parentage, migrant labor, racism against South Asians. Some of the ones that I have up there that are interesting to look at. One is Our Accent, which looks at the damaging and alienating effects of Arabic, and Emirati accent living in a multilingual place. So it's kind of a critique of Arabish. As it's spoken in the Emirates. Al Kandura looks at the Kandura, which is national dress, which is a complicated thing to discuss, but looks at how young people think about it and what they actually know about the history. Layers looks at the abaya, the language and dress being visible markers of who's a citizen. By doing this, they reified this national identity above tribal identity, and they also flatten out taboo subjects such as ethnic identities, and that comes from intermarriages with Indians, Iranians, as well as descendants of African slaves. Cultural connections to history and legend are often topics in these films, and a lot of these films are made by students. There's a student level, and then there's a kind of adult level, I guess we call it. So they look at history such as the legend, Duais, which is the jinn from Ras Al Khaimah, and there's actually the images that you see on the top are from that, and it was a feminist critique of that kind of legend which gets made. There was a Hollywood, produced in the Emirates film, but Toby Hooper directed this film called Jinn, which it took forever for them to make it, and this is like a legitimate version of that. Short films also acknowledge the globalized Gulf today, such as narratives of a young Ethiopian woman arriving, straight to Abu Dhabi to go down to Al Ain to work as a domestic laborer. Some challenge cultural traditions. Naila Kajna has made quite a bit of films. One of hers is Once, which is about dating outside parental consent. There's another one, Nisfa Emirati, Half Emirati, which is about the social stigmatization of not being fully Emirati, and that has citizenship rights in certain moments, depending on who your mother and who your father are. There's other ones that look at teenage boys that skip school and kind of raise hell, and it kind of reminded me of the Quatre Cents Coups, the Truffaut film, in the sense that it critiqued an education policy. So it's a indirect critique of the state education policy, which is constantly in flux, particularly for male students. Other films examine concerns of young Gulf Arabs, such as these are the controversial topics, and down below are the ones looking at other connections. Constructing Dreams was one that looked at the dreams of migrant construction workers. Why did they come? Were they willing to put up with these particular conditions? YES to School were student volunteers to help restore school in Ajman. Ajman's one of the northern Emirates, which is not super wealthy, and these were students, I think, from Dubai, if I'm remembering the film correctly, who went up there. Other films, Dreams in Their Eyes, were 3 students who went up and interviewed Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Other ones that are just comedic. Is it on the next slide? No, I don't know where it is on my slides, but there's one called the Gamboa Revolution, which was about, there was this trend where you'd make your hair really high underneath your shela. So it was a mockumentary on this that became a big hit, and everybody saw it. Although these films are not made with For Nonsense in mind, Creative Lab at 2454, which is the Abu Dhabi Media Authority, does produce, and I want to emphasize that they produce these films for young people. And these are short films that are screened sometimes before feature films at different events, and even as in-flight entertainment on Etihad Airways, the national airline. And these are features where they also show films like Cicero and From A to B, the later ones I was talking about. They are selected to represent the UAE to foreign travelers as a counterpart to the tourism campaign, quote, Travelers Welcome, and that was a big campaign that we've had for years now, that emphasized the UAE as a territorial crossroads for Arab and European travelers and de-emphasized its more significant history as a maritime entrepot for South Asian, Iranian, and East African traders. And among them, some that I remember are The Long Way Down and another one called Visa Run, and they both were kind of more or less exactly the same. They attempted to address negative British stereotypes for Arabs as terrorists, and the Gulf as a haven for terrorists. And this is looking at London's own kind of fantasies about the Gulf, as well as negative Emirati stereotypes of British expatriates as, immoral, immodest, Jamira Janes. There's a whole bunch of stereotypes that get thrown out there, but also more importantly, ignorant of the transnational history that connects Britain to the Emirates, which is controversial in the way that that's explained on both sides of that thing. So they're manipulating what's going out, and I think they're kind of foreclosing some of the more complicated debates that take place on the lower, the films that are not quite distributed internationally. So I'm ending with aspirations and speculations. I see I have overtime. Okay. It's not that long. So in light of the diversity of Emirati filmmaking and the relative absence of a sustainable exhibition platform, including online ones for user-generated content, as well as sustained support for cultural institutions such as film festivals, film journals, and cinematheques, the question of locating the future of Emirati filmmaking becomes more uncertain after these two setbacks, so these cancellation of these two film festivals. Egyptian film critic and programmer Joseph Fahin had described the situation as possible. And this is a lot of name of agencies, but it's just to show you how things shift a lot and how that has consequences. So the Abu Dhabi Film Festival initially was under ADASH, the Abu Dhabi Authority for Culture and Heritage. Then it got shifted onto the Abu Dhabi Tourism and Cultural Authority, the TCA. And then it got shifted last year under 2454, which is the media zone. And that's when it got canceled because they decided to focus on, Hollywood productions. So he describes this, quote, going from, quote, becoming the biggest film festival in the region, which is some of the things that it was trying to do, to, quote, allowing commerce to triumph over art development. So if he's correct, Abu Dhabi is actually moving away from the typical anti-Hollywood kind of cultural model of cultivating cultural capital, and this is places like France has done this, South Korea has done this, other places, to this Hollywood model, which is just about accumulating cultural and financial capital, even at the expense of negative stereotypes, anything to make money. Hollywood and European film industry professionals and technicians often disparage the EFC and the More Film Awards for, quote, lacking stories or lacking technical know-how. But these assessments can seem both naive and self-promoting at times. Emirati filmmakers display an awareness of both, and I'm quoting from a colleague of mine, quote, their privilege and their limited production values of their work, which is not about plot, pacing, and story. Take a back seat to creating the setting in favor of the sea, the sun, virtues of purity and innocence, often through bondage between two male characters and nostalgia for this pre-war area. And this is my colleague Ali Yunus, who supervised the students who founded the Zuma Film Festival. So transnational and national audiences, acculturated to Hollywood's formulaic three-act structures, or the current version of that, might find Emirati filmmaking frustrating. But as Yunus points out, such formulas are not part of Bedouin storytelling traditions. They're not anecdotal, they're not part of the poetic traditions. They're also evident, which you see is evident in the films, which are less based on dialogue and to support the plot and themes, and more on things like facial expressions, emotional landscapes, etc. To support the aspiring and established Emirati filmmakers, a vibrant film culture, I think, is really needed in terms of all the different things that I talked about, particularly film criticism. Presently, what is written about films is limited to newspaper journalism, which at best creates awareness of films being shot, whether it's, lots of Bollywood films get shot, Hollywood films, or Emirati films. But at worst, it tends to rephrase press releases, and that's what you see mostly. It's exactly, almost word for word, what was in the press release by whoever was producing it. So most report film journals and cinematheques, a state agency could provide more holistic approach to its publicized goal, and this is on the website, quote, growing local talent and nurturing the local film community. If Emirati filmmaking is to be located, the question of locating it thus is aspirational and speculative. But locating on a map of global film and media challenge us to rethink these comfortable habits that have been defined by the way that we think about film, either in terms of nation states or regions, and also evaluating the imperfections as consequences of scarce financial resources. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this inspiring talk, and I think there's a lot more to talk about the movies, and you wrapped it up quite quickly already. So we are going to further to Nele Lenz's talk, and I'm happy to introduce Nele to you. She's a research fellow at the Middle East Institute as well, and our replaceable editor here in Singapore, and she holds a PhD in the in Middle Eastern Studies and Media Studies from the University of Oslo, where she also lectured on the Arab online sphere. She obtained her MA in Arabic literature from the Freie University of Berlin. Recently, from the books published here at MEI, she co-edited, for instance, Converging Regions, Global Perspectives on Asia and the Middle East, together with Charlotte Shriver, our deputy director, and also research senior research fellow here at MEI, and also maybe to mention the book The Arab Uprisings, Catalysts, Dynamics and Trajectories, together with Michael Hudson and Fahad Al-Sumaid. Nele, we are listening to her talk about writing literature online in the Gulf. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, so my title is different. It's Literature and Poetry Online in the Gulf and Global and Regional Interactions. And yeah, it's the last talk for today, and then we have a discussion and then wrapping up the conference. So, yes, literature and poetry in the Gulf developed upon a rich culture of oral traditions, and that's true until now. And in the age of new media, distribution of literature and literary production has changed and offers a wide spectrum of story transmission, and that's what I'm talking about today. So Arab countries in the Gulf, such as Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, have an active scene of authors that write online and for online media. And that's already happening since 2003, so it's not something very new. There was always people who published short stories in forums and on blogs, and then there's I have to start maybe. Yes. Then there's a Kuwaiti online publishing house that takes a more official stance on this, yeah. And then this is also used as a kind of form of communication because it generates lots of commentary and interaction, and I will talk about this later. So YouTube plays a big role, and I will give one example of, so on YouTube you have poetry recitations that are online, and some of them go viral, and then these literature platforms contribute to a progress in literature making and a spreading and more discussions on literature, and they serve as connectors between traditional culture and new media. And more writers combine traditional storytelling and forms of transmission with and classical themes with images and GIFs, animations and blogs, and so it gets so popular that online literature now is more and more discussed on TV or in public panels or in mainstream media and radio, and because it's perceived by a broad audience. And that encouraged more people to write online, and so it's always increasing. But in addition to writing online opens possibilities to publish with less state intervention. So what you publish does not need to go through a ministry before it gets out. So that's one important factor. And then also there does not need to be a commercial interest. So that makes it easier to share your work. So here I want to talk about interactions of different kinds in literary output. And one reason why I chose the Gulf as a research field is that the online penetration rate is pretty high. This is also due to lots of experts, so you can't really tell who's using the internet, but the numbers are so high that you can assume the local population is using the internet a lot. And then also it's not so much of an elitist phenomenon because people are educated and have access to media and free time to create stuff, and that's different from other places. So on the one hand, I will mainly show like one example of a poem that was performed in Bahrain and then filmed and then went viral. And on the other hand, I will show like brief examples of what else is going on in digital literature in the Gulf. And this will all be framed in the context of global and regional interaction. So I look at what does it do locally and how it affects global perceptions. So that's what I want to talk about. That's Ayat al-Qummusi, and she performed a poem on Dawa al-Lu'lu' in Bahrain, and she performed a political poem as a form of protest, and that was in the early days of the the protests in Bahrain in March 25, 2011. Yeah, and when she performed it, she was 20 years old. And a poem that got her in big trouble afterwards is describing a conversation between Satan and King Hamad bin Khalifa. So that's maybe why she got in more trouble, but also it's a political activity. Yeah. So I will not go into a literary analysis of this poem because that's not the right place. But I will just show how it worked out, how it was perceived, and then how it generated a bigger audience. So she performed it in front of 300 people, and the poem sums up common criticism, stating the violence against Bahraini people, and then she compares that even Satan does not understand how you can be so violent against people. So the degree of violence is so hard that not even the most evilest being can understand. And then she raises important topics such as corruption and media manipulation and issues of mobilizing Shia against Sunni. And I thought maybe we have a short look at how this was performed. We will not watch the whole video because it's too long, but maybe it's nice to just see how this was happening. And maybe we can, Jason, fast forward a little bit. Yeah.
لمن يظن بأنه سيرقص على أوجاعنا التي ستخلفها الفتنة الطائفية وعلى رأسهم قناة العين الواحدة.
الله يحميها إن شاء الله. وقت واحدة كلمة.
لا نريد العيش في قصر ولا نهو الرئاسة. لا نريد العيش في قصر ولا نهو الرئاسة. نحن شعب يقتل الذل ويغتال التعاسة. نحن شعب يهدم الظلم بسلم من أساسه. نحن شعب لا نريد الشعب يبقى في انتكاسه.
300 people in the audience who were supporting what she said. So the audience joined in with Down with Hamad, and there was a big support from the audience, and then she kept reciting this poem for 10 minutes, and then someone filmed this, as we can see now, and put it online, and then it went viral after she got arrested for this, because it's also a good image because it's a young woman and everyone can relate to, and poetry shouldn't be that evil that you get arrested for it. With uploading the video, not only local audiences got to know about the performance, but also an international community, which was then able to take notice of the events in Bahrain, because they are not so often in the media. They are not so there's not so much reporting, but if you have a case like this, maybe there's more possibilities to relate to the topic. And then someone added English subtitles, which made it more accessible to the rest of the world. And the performance also gained a lot of attention because she got arrested by the authorities shortly after, and the distribution and spread of the video shows that political poetry is inspired and performed because of local events, and that's, I think, what everyone talked about. All this media creation is always inspired by local events, and without people on the ground, the whole media production wouldn't be necessary or reach such a wide audience. So, but the publication of online media helps to disseminate issues of political struggle, and especially the one in Bahrain is hardly disseminated to a global audience. Yeah, that's just it reaches an international audience. And then now I talk about the other part of online literature that I studied for much longer, and that's literature that is produced for digital media, and it's also political, but it's also about a lot of other topics, like Dale's short movies that he presents like everyday life. So writers turn to online distribution for a variety of reasons, and one of them is that it's relatively easy to distribute works online. This is the Kuwaiti publishing house. So first, it works instantly and without finding a commercial market. That's important. And second, writers can avoid needing approval from state authorities. And third, writers can publish relatively anonymously. That doesn't mean anonymously, but at least social censorship can be avoided by using a pseudonym. And in addition to the concrete example of the poetry on YouTube, there's an infinite amount of short stories and visual novels and poetry online, and they are distributed in forums and in blogs and on their own websites. And there's also this e-publishing house I showed before that picks up different Gulf short stories and poems and novellas and turns them into something more professional, so more people have access to it, and it's more institutionalized. But if you publish there, you also have to follow rules, and if you publish on your own blog, you don't have to follow rules, you can just follow your own rules. So literary platforms appear in a variety of formats, and the most common of these are forums. At least in the Gulf, short stories are spread in forums, and they get emailed to each other and all that. Yes, in comparison to blogs, where on blogs authors have their own platform to write, and then in forums you don't. They are usually on a variety of topics, but there's also one section for poetry and one section for short stories. And I once wrote a paper about the traveling of the short stories. There are short stories that are picked up and then they're re-narrated and remixed, and then someone else it's like retelling a story, but not in an oral coffee shop like 100 years ago, but now it's online. And then, of course, we have Tumblr, where short poems are reposted, and that's more about reposting than about like actually commenting on it. And yeah, the thing about publishing online is that social censorship can be a little bit avoided, but it's just a superficial anonymization, as Saha already said, and many of the others. If you have an IP address, you can always track back and identify every political activist, which leads to the conclusion that the virtual place is not a safer place than the actual public space. But at least you can, if it's not too political and you write short stories about sexuality or minor political issues, then at least your family doesn't know about you publishing this. And I did some interviews in Oman where this was very important to the authors, that they could write love stories without being involved with family matters. So yeah, now I quickly talk about global and regional interactions. So that there are different interactions globally and regionally. First of all these cultural productions are always made for a local audience. Most of the time, it's for an audience that is familiar with the language, the dialect, because a lot of it is written in dialect. And there are two levels of interactions. First, it's the intertextuality and the interactivity that comes with sharing stories, remixing stories. You all know this from YouTube. You have a funny video, it gets remixed all the time. And then the author loses the rights on his or her own story because it's getting to be a public cultural product, so it's always picked up by someone else, and copying and remixing is one of the most important features of cultural production on the internet. But on the other hand, there's the online sphere, that's regional and global, and while most online activities are happening regionally, global interactions can be seen as well. But the global distinctions can be definitely seen in a way that, for example, in the Gulf there might be more poetry published online than, for example, in South or East Asia. And the audience of these cultural products is mostly local due to the language. That means poetry is performed and composed for an audience that is familiar with the dialect and the heritage and the themes, and the same is true for short stories as well as blogs. But globally, online production can have an impact too. Most recently, you could see this with the cultural online production from the uprisings, but also everything that has to do with ISIS and videos that were made and Tumblr images, and so online, more possibilities exist to distribute cultural production and political thought, and this is due to the relatively low effort of publishing content. However, in order to reach people on the ground, there always needs to be some level of performance, protest, event on the ground that generates attention. Certainly more literary and other cultural products are in the Gulf published online than in print. This is due to the restrictions. And then there's this Kuwaiti digital artist who said, his name is Abdallah Mutairi, and he does a lot of digital art with videos and pictures and images, and he says that communication strategies online are stretched far in the Gulf, so you can really push boundaries, and it enables people to keep a strong focus on the local and regional, while at the same time form a connection to the external. And now I conclude. So online it's easier to reach a wider audience, and sometimes even an international audience. And the physical place of the performance of Al-Qumasi, the Dawa Alulu, that doesn't exist anymore. They took it away, they destroyed the place, because for some reason the government thought with destroying the place you don't have opposition anymore. So it was torn down, and the removal of the physical place of protest seems like a desperate attempt to create silence. And when the physical space becomes inaccessible, then the virtual space gains more importance, and that means instant outreach can shift to a virtual space. So local production of online cultural content empowers writers, because you find a like-minded people and find a point of identification, and local literature can spread within regions, but it can also, if you have the subtitles or you translate something to a global audience. So global interactions are mostly made when it comes to political performance, but you still have all kinds of other poetry and short story production for a regional space. That's all I wanted to present.
And thank you, Dale, for these two bright presentations. And I think we got a very complimenting overview about the spectrum of how the representation or the cultural production of identities and of regions and local issues, worries, etc., through film or literature and poetry can be produced, can be performed, and also can be disseminated, which Nele showed us is very important through the online sphere, which is a new medium for showing this entanglement also of global and regional spheres and topics. So I think we have another 10 minutes for questions from the auditorium to our two speakers today. And then we might, at the end, have a couple of minutes for general questions, which might still be in the room from the conference in general, before Nele will make the wrap-up of the conference. Please.
Okay, thank you both for... Is it working? Oh, okay. Thank you both for very interesting talks. And my question is primarily for Dale, but also like Nele, if you also have some insight from the written sphere on that, it would be interesting. I saw that there was one of the movies that you referred to had to do with language or the dialect. So recently I saw a video clip which was made in what is called Pidgin Arabic, like the contact variety that is emerging in the Gulf among the workers who do not speak Arabic, and this depicts like a maid who is running away from her sponsor and her lover, Indian lover, who is running after her, but they sing in this kind of Gulfi Pidgin Arabic. So I'm interested in, is there any reference in the contemporary cinematic production to that phenomenon, of which I only know by extension? A lot of my colleagues who work on the Gulf are interested in it. And also maybe if it features in any kind of any references in literature online, but in the movies primarily, because you did say that one of the preoccupations is with identity, with language, and there is this question of what is happening to language in the Gulf with all the maids coming from this part of the world and working there. Thank you.
It's difficult to answer because there are a lot of these films, and I have only seen a very small portion of them, and we're trying to collect them, and I'm trying to get students to work on them to pick up. A lot of times it's Emirate-specific accent is what you get mixed in. I don't know of any that cover this topic, which is really interesting. But you do get a lot of drivers, etc., little minor characters who speak in an imperfect Arabic. That happens in it as well. One of the last slides, there was a lot that I didn't talk about, is one of the Ramadan serials, Frij, which is a very, I think it was the first 3D animation in the Emirates, not in the world or any place. And I spoke to Mohammed Haib, who created the series, and told him about how I'd met this French linguist who did this masterful interpretation of all the different accents. So it's supposed to be old Dubai, the old Frij, and one character has a very Persian inflected, and she's the Asham character, and then another character has this accent and another like that. So it plays out, but he wasn't able to tell me where this came from. He has hundreds of people who work for him, so it's definitely something that's part of it. But I don't see it systematized. It's probably more so in literature. Alternate to Nelly.
Yeah, for the short stories, you have a lot of Pidgin Arabic picked up, but also just in dialogues, because like almost all the short stories that are circulating, they're all written in Khaliji dialect, and it's usually when a driver is involved or a maid is involved, they all speak Arabic, but Pidgin Arabic is, for me it's sometimes difficult to find out what it means, because I'm staying there for a year is not enough to know everything, but but there's a lot of picking up on this, because I think specifically when they talk to drivers or someone makes up an accent, and but it's also there's a lot of English in Arabic written, like what you showed, so you can find this too.
Hi, this is a question for Dale. In Doha, a group of young Qataris were disenchanted with the Doha Film Institute, so they decided to make their own media production house, and they obviously had their own funding and their own resources. How much of this is going on in the Emirates? Is there like small independent production houses? And what is NYU Abu Dhabi doing towards production?
I think I'm going to not answer the second one for a few reasons. I'll talk to you privately about that. I don't know of any dissatisfaction, but I'm sure it exists. I'm at a startup institution, so I don't get to go outside that often because I'm always doing service and advising students. However, I think that there probably would be things going on that way, and there's a lot of smaller, low-key initiatives. One of my colleagues, who's a biologist and a filmmaker at the same time, did a high school program, and it was to help students kind of take a camera and make something in 2 hours, and he actually took it seriously. So I think that there's little micro movements versus the things that are done by the media zone, which are, tell us your idea and we'll make a film for you, and then we'll control it. So I imagine there's stuff going on. Our system is behind Doha in some ways. Dubai is a little bit more advanced, and I don't know that seems well.
Thank you so much for the interesting presentations. Nelly, two important points that came up in your presentation, which I thought were very interesting. The government appropriation of physical space of protest or demonstration, as you have mentioned about the Lulu square in the heart of Manama in Bahrain. The same thing somehow happened in Egypt in a different form, but Tahrir Square is not the same as it used to be. Now, if you go there, there's going to be military, barricades and military cars all over the place in a way that does not allow the place to be really a physical space of protest anymore as it used to be in the past. The same happened in the Lulu Square, but of course in Manama it was destroyed completely. So again, it would be interesting to think about what that means and how this can be reflected also in forms of art or literature or creativity online as well as offline. The second point is, I was really pleased that you raised the example of Ayat al-Gumaizi, because she links very well to what I was talking about earlier in terms of shattering the myth or the stereotypes around Arab and Muslim women, because this 20-year-old woman became an iconic figure of protest and revolution and courage, not just for fellow women, but interestingly enough for men as well. A lot of men said, if this 20-year-old girl can get up on stage and be so brave and courageous as to recite a poetry that is against the monarch and to go to jail for it, then she becomes an inspirational model. So again, that opens the door for discussions about new forms of feminism like Islamic feminism, a new form of political agency and mobilization for these women, and what that means moving forward in shattering the myth and stereotypes around Arab and Muslim women. And for both of you, Dale and Nelly, I have the question of all of these forms of art and creativity and production, whether in terms of film or poetry or literature. What can it possibly pinpoint or highlight for us moving forward in the realm of cyber activism, right? All of these, the region, of course, the Gulf region being one of the most affluent regions in the world. At the same time, 70% or more are less than 30 or 35 years of age, technologically savvy, very smart, using the new technology. What does that tell us moving forward in terms of the possibility of creating some kind of radical, maybe socio-political transformation in this part of the world? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I even think with the poetry, it didn't really, it was more interesting for a foreign audience that it was a woman, because they didn't expect a young woman to perform like that. And the possibilities, I don't know. I always think culture, humor, music, that encourages and inspires people. That's how you reach an audience. And political blogging is important to get across ideas, but I think you usually preach to the choir because it's long text. Not everyone reads this, but if there's more culture that reaches the people immediately, doesn't matter where in the world. Now you have protests all over the world. If it's funny, or if it's music, or if it's like in Tahrir, so many things happened, and if you transfer this to online media, then and you need a bigger global network. I mean, it already was visible in the Arab uprisings that things were moving, but if you have a bigger global network of making culture together and creating things together, I think that would push a lot of things forward if you have global interactivities. Yeah.
I don't think anything radically political is going to happen in UAE anytime in the near future, because it gets shut down quite quickly these days. However, I think that there's a lot of what I find interesting about it is that there's a lot of ways that you can kind of go around, and you can discuss things in indirect ways. And another model which I did discuss in the part of this paper that I presented to you was looking at the Saudi web serials. And those are really important. Again, they use humor as ways to critique the state or state policies in very indirect ways. There's, I think, more nuance in some of those. Some of them are very childish in ways, but some of them I think are much more nuanced than like Wajda, Haifal Mansour's film, which got read in one way by people, foreigners, and then kind of people, Saudis, were reading it in a very different way when they were watching it and saying it's not very political in a lot of ways. So I think those might be the things to look at, is how you can open discussions in sometimes slower ways than you'd want, but you might make more progress ultimately than making things really big. And with the art museums is an interesting example, is that all the activism that went out kind of shut things down, and it became harder to talk about things. But then surprisingly, the New York Times articles on the Guggenheim and NYU for our first graduation actually opened things up a little bit in a way. So it's kind of hard to predict, but people tend to be more kind of cautious and indirect and working through micro networks rather than through big events.
Yeah, time is not on our side, which is, I guess, a good sign for a sparkling panel. Let me thank you both for the contributions and the discussion, and yeah, maybe an applause. And I'm pleased to hand over to Nele for the closing remarks.
Okay, this will be very brief. First of all, I have to, it will really be brief. I know when people say this will be brief, I just take another 90 to 120 minutes to sum things up. Before I forget, I want to say all the thank yous, because it's for this, as you all communicated with Huda and Zubaida, I think without them this would not have been possible, and they put so much effort into this, and they were really great job. And then we had Redna and Romel who helped around all the time, and then we also had Shafika, Dibika and Jason, who took part of a lot of the organizational work or helping create a nice backdrop. And the only thing I really forgot to mention yesterday was that we had a hashtag all the time for Twitter. But and Dibika, Shafika, Redna and Jason, I think they were all tweeting, so if we didn't tweet, that's someone took care of that. You can tweet afterwards or retweet. Yes, and then of course Charlotte and Peter and Helen did a great job supporting us with this. And then without all the speakers and participants and the chairs, this would not have been such an inspiring and beautiful event. So thank you for all coming and participating and discussing and speaking. Yes. And I hope I didn't forget anyone, but I thank everyone who was involved. Yeah. So I think for me at least, this was a really productive and inspiring 2 days, and I really enjoyed everyone being here with discussing a wide range of topics, but they were all kind of connected to each other. So news and social media, and then we had civil engagement a lot and talking about the uprisings, women's issues, political issues, military engagement, civil engagement, and then it was nice to look at the economical side, but also at the non-economical and like cultural side, and the empirical studies and deeper analysis, and then more descriptive, and everything was really nicely mixed, I think. So we got a lot of different perspectives, and then I liked that it was a mix of digital and film and conventional media and everything, and theory, globalization and gender, and then I think we looked at everything from Morocco to Korea. Which I like that Korea got picked up 3 times in this conference because it really has an impact. State intervention, mobilization, language, and arts and culture. So this was all. I really enjoyed everyone's contribution from the audience and from the speakers. So thank you for that. And then I should not forget. I would like to make a book, an edited volume. So if you haven't sent your chapters yet, and if you want to contribute to this, it would be wonderful if you send me your chapters or longer talks. We are pretty quick at MEI to turn over the books. I think last year's conference volume will be out in October, and we had 2 coming out last year, so everything is working really smoothly. So yeah, again, I want to thank everyone for being here, and if you have other questions related to the conference, this is the last opportunity to ask. Yes. And Peter maybe wants to say something.
Well, this is, to me, a most fascinating and most wonderful 2 days. And of course, we owe everything to Nella for putting this together. And what a pleasure it is to work with somebody with her unobtrusive forcefulness, which is a great virtue. I wish I knew how to do it as well as she does. But the book will come and so forth, as she says. And I'm enormously grateful to her, as I'm sure everybody else is, for putting this together and making such a very, very nice atmosphere. Thank you very much.